71 degrees Celsius isn't just cold. It's a death sentence. In the frozen heart of Yakutia, a betrayal unfolded that was colder than the ice itself. An 82-year-old woman was left to freeze, tied to a tree by her own blood. But he didn't count on the only witness watching from the shadows, a stray dog with a warrior's heart. The thermometer on the dashboard of the rusted Toyota Land Cruiser read 64 degrees Celsius, but the wind chill outside was screaming something closer to 71 degrees Celsius. In this part of Yakutia, known to the locals as the Pole of Cold, the air itself feels solid. If you breathe too deeply, your lungs can spasm. If you cry, your tears freeze before they hit your cheek. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, clutching a worn leather handbag that contained nothing but a faded photograph of her late husband and a small bag of hard candies. At 82, Margaret was frail, her bones brittle like dry twigs, but her eyes were sharp, usually filled with the warmth of a grandmother who had seen everything. Today, however, they were filled with confusion. "Are we close, Ryan?" she asked, her voice trembling not just from the cold seeping through the door seals, but from a nagging fear she couldn't quite name. Ryan, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth, didn't look at her. He gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. "Almost. Aunt Margaret, the new clinic is just past the old logging road. They have better heating there. You'll see." Ryan was her only living relative, her sister's son, a man who had spent the last 10 years gambling away every ruble he earned in the mining towns. Margaret had bailed him out more times than she could count, selling her jewelry, her good china, and finally, dipping into the savings meant for her own funeral. But last week, she had said the word that changes everything in a family of leeches. No. She had refused to sign over the deed to her small, sturdy wooden house in the valley, the only thing she had left. The car swerved off the main icy highway, known grimly as the Road of Bones, and crunched onto an unplowed track leading deep into the taiga. The trees here were ancient sentinels, bowed heavy under snow that had fallen months ago and turned to concrete hard ice. "Ryan, there's nothing out here," Margaret whispered, clutching the door handle. "Please, let's go back." "Shut up," Ryan snapped, the veneer of the caring nephew cracking instantly. He slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt in a clearing that felt like the end of the world. The silence outside was absolute. In Yakutia, at these temperatures, there are no birds, no engine noises, just the deafening sound of your own blood rushing in your ears. Ryan exited the car. The cold air rushed in as he opened her door, hitting Margaret like a physical blow. He didn't help her out. He yanked her. "Ryan, what are you doing?" she screamed, her frail legs scrambling for purchase on the blue ice. He didn't speak. He dragged her toward a massive larch tree, its bark stripped and frozen. From his heavy coat pocket, he pulled a length of industrial-grade nylon rope, yellow, bright and cruel against the white landscape. "You should have just signed the papers, Margaret," Ryan grunted, struggling with the knot as his gloves made his fingers clumsy. He wrapped the rope around her waist, then her chest, pinning her arms to her sides against the rough trunk. "Ryan, you can't leave me here. It's death. It's murder." Margaret wailed, the panic finally overriding the shock. She struggled, but she was 82, and he was a desperate man fueled by debt and greed. "It's not murder," Ryan muttered, tightening the final knot. He looked her in the eye, and, for a second, Margaret saw the terror in him too, the terror of a man crossing a line he could never uncross. "It's just nature. They'll say you wandered off. Dementia. It happens all the time." He stepped back. The cold was already biting through Margaret's wool coat. She could feel the heat draining from her body as if a plug had been pulled. "Ryan!" she screamed one last time, her voice cracking. He didn't look back. He got into the Land Cruiser, the engine roaring to life, spewing a cloud of gray exhaust into the pristine air. He reversed, the tires spinning on the ice, and then he was gone. The taillights faded into the white mist, leaving Margaret alone in the most hostile environment on planet Earth. She was alone, or so she thought. What Ryan hadn't noticed, and what Margaret was too terrified to see, was a pair of heterochromatic eyes, one ice blue, one amber, watching from the snowbank just 20 yards away. 10 minutes. That's how long it takes for exposed skin to develop frostbite at 50 degrees Celsius. At 71 degrees Celsius, the timeline is accelerated. The body enters a state of panic preservation. Blood is pulled from the extremities to the core to keep the heart and lungs functioning. Margaret's fingers were the first to go numb. The pain was excruciating, a burning sensation like fire, before it settled into a dull, heavy absence of feeling. She tugged at the yellow ropes, but the nylon had frozen stiff, becoming as hard as steel cables. She tried to scream for help, but the air was too sharp. Inhaling deeply felt like swallowing razor blades. Her throat constricted, and her cries were reduced to whimpering clouds of steam that crystallized instantly in front of her face. This is it, she thought, her mind beginning to drift. The euphoria of hypothermia was creeping in the stage where the brain stops fighting the cold and begins to embrace it. She thought of her kitchen, the smell of baking bread, the warmth of her fireplace. She closed her eyes, ready to sleep. A wet, warm sensation on her hand jolted her back to reality. Margaret's eyes fluttered open. Standing on his hind legs, paws resting gently on her bound knees, was a dog. It wasn't a purebred husky or a pampered pet. It was a beast of the taiga, a massive mix, likely part alibi and part wolfhound. His coat was a matted fortress of gray and white fur, thick enough to withstand the apocalypse. One ear was torn, a battle scar from a life on the streets. "Barnaby?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. She recognized him. He was a stray that roamed the outskirts of her village, while other neighbors threw rocks at him or shooed him away. Fearing his size, Margaret had always left out the leftovers from her dinners, beef bones, stale bread soaked in gravy. He never came close enough to be petted, always snatching the food and vanishing into the woods. She had named him Barnaby, though he had never answered to it. Until now, the dog whined, a high-pitched sound that cut through the silence. He didn't look wild now. He looked frantic. Barnaby dropped to all fours and began to pace around the tree. He sniffed the ropes, his hot breath visible in the air. He seemed to understand the mechanics of the trap. He gnawed at the knot behind the tree, growling low in his throat. But Ryan had used industrial nylon. It was too thick, and frozen too solid for even Barnaby's powerful jaws to sever quickly. Realizing he couldn't cut her loose, the dog changed tactics. The intelligence in his eyes was startling. He understood the immediate threat wasn't the rope. It was the cold. Barnaby moved to the front of the tree. He looked at Margaret, his mismatched eyes locking with hers. Then, he did something that defied all animal instinct for self-preservation. Instead of curling up in a snowbank to conserve his own heat, Barnaby reared up again. He pressed his massive, fur-covered chest directly against Margaret's torso. He wrapped his front paws around her legs as best he could, essentially hugging her. He was a furnace. The heat radiating from his body was intense. He burrowed his head into the crook of her neck, his warm breath blowing against her freezing skin, thawing the ice that had begun to form on her eyelashes. "Good boy." Margaret wept, the tears freezing on her cheeks but her heart thumping a little stronger. "You shouldn't be here, Barnaby. You'll freeze too." The dog ignored her. He shifted his weight, pressing harder, maximizing the contact between his body and hers. He became a living shield against the wind. Hours passed. The sun began to dip below the horizon, plunging the taiga into a purple, bruised twilight. The temperature dropped further. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time her head lolled forward, signaling the final sleep, Barnaby would bark a sharp, explosive sound right in her ear, or lick her face aggressively with his rough tongue, forcing her to wake up. He was bullying her into staying alive, but even a dog as strong as Barnaby has limits. Margaret could feel his shivering begin. It started as a low tremor and grew into violent shakes. He was transferring all his thermal energy to her, sacrificing his own metabolic reserves. His whimpers became softer, more pained. Suddenly, Barnaby's ears pricked up. He pulled his head back from her neck and stared into the darkening woods. He let out a low, menacing growl, the hair on his back standing up like needles. Margaret couldn't hear anything over the wind, but Barnaby could. Footsteps, crunching on the snow. Not the heavy stomp of a man, but the stealthy, padded rhythm of a pack. Wolves. In Yakutia, when the temperature drops this low, the wolf packs get desperate. They had smelled the vulnerability. They had smelled the freezing woman. Barnaby disentangled himself from Margaret. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stepped 5 feet in front of her. Planting his paws wide in the snow, he bared his teeth, a guttural roar erupting from his chest that sounded like a chainsaw revving up. From the shadows of the tree line, 3 pairs of glowing green eyes emerged. Timber wolves, gaunt, hungry, and massive. Margaret watched in horror. She was tied to a tree, unable to move, about to watch her only savior be torn apart. "Run, Barnaby," she croaked. "Run." Barnaby didn't move an inch. He stood between the old woman and the devils of the forest, ready to sell his life dearly. The lead wolf lunged. The standoff lasted only seconds, but to Margaret, time seemed to warp, stretching into an eternity of terror. The alpha wolf, a gaunt beast with a scar running through its left eye, didn't bark. It didn't growl. It simply lowered its head, ears flattened, calculating the trajectory of the kill. Barnaby didn't back down. He was a creature of the streets. A dog who had fought for every scrap of food he had ever eaten. He knew he was outmatched in weight and numbers, but he had something the wolves didn't, a desperate, suicidal devotion. He wasn't fighting for territory or food. He was fighting for the fragile, freezing life behind him. The first wolf, a smaller female on the right flank, snapped forward. It was a feint. Barnaby lunged to meet her, his jaws snapping shut on empty air. But the distraction worked. The alpha struck from the center. A blur of gray fur and white teeth collided with Barnaby's chest. The impact knocked the breath out of the brave dog, slamming him back against Margaret's frozen shins. She felt the heavy thud, a vibration of violence that traveled up her numb legs. Barnaby recovered instantly. With a roar that sounded more lion than canine, he twisted in the snow, locking his jaws onto the alpha's neck fur. The wolf yelped, a high-pitched sound that shattered the icy silence. Barnaby shook his head violently, throwing the wolf off balance. But the third wolf seized the opening. It clamped its teeth onto Barnaby's hind leg. Margaret screamed a dry, rasping sound. "Leave him alone! Take me! Just take me!" Barnaby didn't whimper. He spun, snapping his hind leg free, leaving a trail of bright crimson blood on the pristine white snow. The pain seemed to fuel him. He planted himself again, panting heavily, steam billowing from his mouth like a locomotive. He was bleeding from 3 different places now, his gray coat matted with red, but he stood firm. He bared his teeth, now stained pink, and issued a low, rumbling challenge that vibrated in Margaret's own chest. "Come and get it." The wolves, sensing the dog's weakening state, began to circle tighter. They were coordinated, intelligent, and patient. They knew the cold was doing half the work for them. Barnaby's legs were shaking not just from the temperature now, but from blood loss. The alpha crouched for the final spring. Barnaby lowered his head, ready to die. Then, the world exploded in light. It came from the logging road, 2 blinding white beams cutting through the purple twilight like lasers. The roar of a high-powered engine shattered the stillness, louder than the wind, louder than the growls. The wolves froze, their eyes reflecting the sudden glare. Crack! A gunshot echoed through the valley, sharp and thunderous. A spray of snow erupted just inches from the alpha wolf's paws. The pack didn't hesitate. The sudden introduction of loud machinery and firearms broke their predatory trance. With synchronized fluidity, they turned and vanished into the tree line, ghosts dissolving back into the darkness. The vehicle, a massive, modified 6-wheel tundra truck equipped with floodlights, crunched over the ice and screeched to a halt 10 yards away. The door flew open before the engine even died. A man jumped out. He was a giant, dressed in a heavy fur-lined parka, a rifle slung over his shoulder. This was Andre, a retired meteorologist who monitored the remote weather stations along the Road of Bones. He had seen the fresh tire tracks of a Land Cruiser heading down a dead-end logging trail and, knowing the deadly forecast, had felt a pit in his stomach. Andre didn't run. The snow was too deep. He waited, his face grim. He saw the scene, and for a moment, he stopped, dead in his tracks. He saw the old woman, blue-lipped and tied to the tree like a sacrificial offering. And he saw the dog. Barnaby was barely standing. He was swaying, his eyes glazing over, but he was still facing the woods, still guarding the perimeter. As Andre approached, Barnaby let out a weak, bubbling growl. "Easy, brother. Easy," Andre said, his voice deep and soothing. He kept his hands visible. "I'm here for her. I'm here to help." Barnaby seemed to understand the tone. Or perhaps he simply had nothing left to give. His legs buckled. He collapsed into the snow, his head landing on Margaret's boot. Andre reached them. He pulled a serrated hunting knife from his belt. "My God," he whispered, seeing the industrial nylon cutting into Margaret's coat. "Who did this to you?" He didn't wait for an answer. He sawed through the ropes with frantic efficiency. As the last knot gave way, Margaret slumped forward. Andre caught her, his massive gloves gentle on her fragile frame. She was stiff, her body temperature critically low. "Am I dead?" Margaret whispered, her eyes unfocused. "Not today, madam. Not on my watch." Andre grunted. He scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing. And not him either. He looked down at Barnaby. The dog was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Andre knew he couldn't carry both at once, and every second mattered. He made a split-second decision. He ran Margaret to the truck, placing her in the passenger seat and cranking the heater to the maximum. He wrapped her in a thermal emergency blanket. "Stay with me," he commanded. Then he ran back for the dog. He hoisted Barnaby's limp, heavy body onto his shoulder, the dog's blood soaking into Andre's expensive parka. He didn't care. He carried the warrior back to the truck and laid him on the back seat, covering him with his own spare wool coat. Andre jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the gear stick into reverse, and grabbed the satellite phone on the dashboard. He dialed the emergency frequency for the hospital in Yakutsk. "This is Station 4. I have 2 code blues," Andre shouted into the receiver as he floored the gas, the truck fishtailing on the ice. "1 human female, severe hypothermia. 1 canine, lacerations and shock. Get the trauma team ready. I'm coming in hot." The recovery room in the Yakutsk Regional Hospital smelled of antiseptic and strong coffee. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only music Margaret had heard for 3 days. Her fingers were bandaged heavily. The doctors had managed to save them, though the nerve damage in her fingertips would likely be permanent. A constant, tingling reminder of the night on the ice. She lay propped up on pillows, her skin pale but no longer the terrifying shade of gray it had been when Andre brought her in. The door creaked open. It was Andre. He looked uncomfortable indoors, his large frame filling the doorway. He was holding a bouquet of supermarket flowers in one hand and a dog leash in the other. "Andre," Margaret rasped, tears welling in her eyes. "I never got to say, don't." Andre interrupted gently, walking to the bedside. "You don't need to say anything, Barnaby?" she asked, the fear spiking in her chest. She hadn't seen the dog since the woods. "Is he?" Andre smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He stepped aside and whistled. From the hallway, a familiar gray shape hobbled in. Barnaby. He was shaved in patches where stitches held his skin together. His left hind leg was in a cast, and he wore a comedic plastic cone around his neck. The cone of shame, the nurses called it, but his tail, that bushy, ragged tail, began to thump against the doorframe the moment he saw her. "Barnaby!" Margaret cried out, ignoring the pain in her ribs as she sat up. The dog limped over to the bed. He couldn't jump up, so he rested his chin on the mattress, right beside her hand. Margaret buried her face in his fur, sobbing uncontrollably. Barnaby licked the tears from her cheeks, making small, comforting whining noises. "He lost a lot of blood," Andre said softly. The vet said another 10 minutes, and his heart would have stopped. He took bites meant for you, Margaret. He refused to let the vets sedate him until he saw you were breathing. They had to wheel his stretcher next to yours in the ER just to get his heart rate down. Margaret stroked the dog's head. He's not a stray anymore. He's my family. He's a hero, Andre corrected. The whole town is talking about him. But Andre's face grew serious. He pulled a chair up and sat down. There is other news about Ryan. Margaret stiffened. The name brought a chill back into the room that the heating couldn't chase away. Did he get away? Andre shook his head grimly. Yakutia has its own way of handling justice, Margaret. The police found the Land Cruiser yesterday. Where? About 15 miles from where he left you. It seems he tried to take a shortcut across the frozen river to avoid the police checkpoints on the main highway. He didn't know the ice in that sector is unstable due to the thermal springs underneath. Margaret gasped. The car broke through the top layer, Andre explained. It didn't sink completely, but it was stuck. The engine flooded and died. The heating failed. Andre leaned forward, his voice dropping. They found him inside. He hadn't frozen to death immediately. He had tried to walk, but the wind was too strong. He crawled back to the car. They found him clutching the steering wheel, and, on the passenger seat, right next to him, was the deed to your house. Margaret looked out the window at the falling snow. It looked beautiful from in here, safe and warm. Out there, it was a judge, jury, and executioner. Ryan had left her to freeze to steal a house, and in the end, the cold had taken him and left the house exactly where it belonged. He wanted everything, Margaret whispered. And he left with nothing. Not nothing, Andre said. He left a legacy, a warning, and he inadvertently brought you and Barnaby together. 6 months later, the wooden house in the valley was warmer than it had ever been. A new, high-efficiency fireplace crackled in the living room installed for free by Andre, who came over for tea every Sunday. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, knitting a red wool sweater. It was a strange shape, too wide for a human. At her feet, sprawled out on a luxurious orthopedic rug, lay Barnaby. He had gained weight, his coat was shiny and brushed, and the limp was almost gone. He was snoring softly, chasing dream rabbits in his sleep. Margaret finished the final stitch and held up the sweater. It was for him. She leaned down and draped it over the sleeping dog. Barnaby opened one amber eye, looked at the sweater, then looked at Margaret. He let out a contented sigh and closed his eye again. They were survivors, both of them, the woman who was too old to matter, and the dog who was too wild to love. The world had tried to freeze them out, but they had started a fire that would never go out. Margaret and Barnaby proved that loyalty isn't about bloodlines. It's about who stays when the rest of the world walks away. In the brutal cold of Yakutia, a stray dog showed more humanity than a human ever could. Justice was served by the ice, but love was saved by a paw. If this story warmed your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us share more incredible stories like Barnaby's. What do you think? Did Ryan deserve his fate, or was it too cruel? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with every dog lover you know.